Welcome to this series of podcasts on the beauty and power of liturgical art. Created through the Chichester Workshop for Liturgical Art and our associates, we explore how God reveals himself to us through the material world, and how we, as a union of matter and spirit, can worship God through works of material beauty.
Today our subject will be, what is liturgical art? What is sacred art? Subsequent ones will look at the effects of liturgical art, points to consider when commissioning it, the role of the style of liturgical art, be it music or architecture or painting, how that is affected by theology and spirituality. But today I'm with a student and dear friend, Heather Pollington, who has worked in the past in the film industry and continues to work there making film set designs. So she's perfectly placed in a way to discuss this topic with us, because liturgical art and the sacred liturgy is a bit like filming, but it's a real filming. It's a real encounter with the living God and not just a performance. So we're at the monastery of St Anthony and St Cuthbert in the Chichester Hills, and Heather and I are going to be discussing our subject of what is liturgical art. Well, welcome, Heather.
Well, thank you. So can you tell us about where we are in the landscape and why we're here?
Yes, so we're in 20 acres of land up on the hills of the Chichester in Shropshire. About 28 years ago, roughly, I founded a hermitage here and did up the old buildings, and we're now in the chapel of the hermitage. It's half a barn converted, the other half at the moment is guest quarters. It used to be the workshop where I made a lot of the things here. So it was just a barn, half underground. The back here was about 4 feet under.
Yeah.
And gradually I converted this, frescoed the walls, used mostly recycling wood to make the floor and the icon screen. So I thought this would be a good place to start, because though it's very small, it sort of has most of the elements we associate with a fully decorated, I don't like the word decorate, but decorated church.
And can you tell me why you chose this particular building to be the chapel?
Good question. Next door was a 2-up, 2-down cottage, so that was where I and others were going to live. I didn't have money to build a purpose-built place, so the only other building literally was this barn. I needed part of it for a workshop, so that literally just left half, really. It's one of those things we've often spoken, how limitation can actually work to good. I did speak to Bishop Callistos, my spiritual father, about the orientation, and it's slightly this way rather than this way, which would be normal, but he said it's really good to point east.
Okay.
So that's why it's an unusual shape. It's sort of this way rather than orientated as a rectangle toward the east. It faces the east. So that's why I've got a slightly unusual shape.
And this roof's lovely, isn't it? How it opens out. Was that something you created? Did you remove a ceiling?
That's right, yes. Ironically, when I was at Mount Athos, I met a man who owned an estate nearby. We just discovered by accident that I was about to move to this property, which had already been bought, and he lived down the road. So he's a fairly wealthy man and a devout. So he said, well, let me know what you need and I'll see if I can help. So he gave the timber. You had a sawmill there which cut the timber, and then I sent it to a place to get planed and made the roof. And Pantocrata, that was commissioned initially by my parish priest. Nearby is the Shrewsbury Orthodox Church I go to. Father Stephen lived at the time when this parish was founded in Welshpool in Wales, and he built a little chapel in his back garden which had a flat dome, if that's not a contradiction, and commissioned this octagonal image. And when he sold the house, we did an exchange. I painted an icon of St Ninian for him in exchange for that. So some recycling, all the timber's recycled, even some of the icons are recycled.
Can you tell me about, once you had the building, what was your vision for creating this chapel? Did it evolve over time, or did you have a set vision and then you executed it immediately?
Yes. One of the roles of liturgical art in general in worship, the Eucharist, is to be a microcosm of the whole. What we do in this 1, 2, 3 hours of church service should, I think, encompass how we want a whole life to be with Christ.
Okay.
It's a spiritual exercise worship, but we're material beings, we're bodily beings, and we use matter. All this here is made out of dust, like these frescoes behind us. These are made of ground up dirt, basically, mixed with lime, which is just burnt stone, basically. But we conduct spiritual worship here. So that was my idea, that I wanted the physicality of this church and the prayers in here to be like the beginning of a fountain, and this water would flow out and affect how I managed the 20 acres of land, how I lived beyond the monastery. So I love the vision of Ezekiel, where he sees the temple, and from under the threshold of the temple flows a river, and wherever the river flows, it gives life. So that was my vision. Then I just responded to the dedication of the monastery. It was St Anthony and St Cuthbert. So along the top are scenes in the life of St Cuthbert and Anthony. And I wanted to show that the Orthodox Church is universal. It's not just for Greeks or Russians. So the choice of saints reflected that. Saints from Russia, Greece, Britain, Cuthbert, Aidan, Isaac the Syrian, all over the world, really.
And so can you explain to me what you consider to be liturgical art? Is it the paintings, or does it go beyond that in terms of what we're seeing here?
Yes, I was reading the notes that you gave me in preparation for this, and I like your very simple description, just basically anything physical that's used in worship. But of course also the sung word. Britain is very strong, of course, in its choral tradition. I think because of the Protestant Reformation, images were sort of put aside as distracting, so we emphasised, especially in the cathedrals, the choral tradition. But liturgical art should encompass painted icons, frescoes, mosaics, furnishings. We'll look later at the wooden floor, which is a mosaic floor, so they have used geometry as iconographic. Fabric, these wonderful fabrics here, hand woven by a Bulgarian friend, embroidered cloth, metalwork, all that. To me, it's like a symphony, it's like a sacred symphony, and every element's important. Even if a drummer hits those drums once in a symphony, it's an essential part of that symphony.
Yes.
So it's all, I think of it as all the physical elements that we use in worship.
So every object that comes into this space has to be considered and has a purpose.
Everything has a purpose. Even if an instrumentalist just plays one note in the symphony, it's essential.
Yeah. And what would that purpose be, do you think?
The word liturgy means work of the people. Eucharist means thanksgiving and prayer. So for me, the role of liturgical art in the context of worship is to make matter articulate in the praise of God. It's interesting that in Genesis, after each day God said it's good, but after he created us humans, he said it's very good. And one reason for this, and St Leontius of Cyprus said that the sun and moon does not praise God of itself, but through me, a human, it praises, the whole creation praises God. I would modify that a bit by saying I think creation can praise God by itself. When a bird's singing, it's praising God, but it can't give thanks. Creation can't give thanks. A hill, for all its beauty, can't give thanks to God. So I see worship and the use of matter as us humans, as priests, prophets, and kings, queens of this created world, as making it more articulate. So liturgical art is a bit like a poet taking words from a dictionary, making them into a beautiful
being a mediator.
Mediator. This is really important. So Maximus, I'm a great fan of Maximus. He talks a lot about the human person as a mediator. Prophet, priest, and king, those three ministries, I think, essential to understanding liturgical art.
And it's about being responsible for the things around us and guiding them in the right direction.
I think our ecological crisis at the moment is an actual result of not worshipping properly. A Catholic friend of mine who's a theologian and specialises in ecology, she said, start with your worship. If something's gone wrong in society, find out what you worship. And as Christians, we're largely to blame, I think, for the ecological crisis. The Protestant denigration of matter, denigration of creation, or misinterpretation of Genesis, where God says, I've given you all this for food. And so we think of the created world as a big bank. We can take money out of it endlessly, and there's always be plenty of money there. No, it's for investing, for like, as you're learning how to paint icons. If you prepare pigments, you've got to, in one sense, destroy the stone. You've got to grind it up so you can lift it up to a higher level. You take a beautiful azurite stone, you've got to grind it, you've got to litigate it. But the whole idea is to lift it to a higher level. So to me, the liturgical art is the ultimate ecology, really.
Yeah, is it the physical world exists, we exist in it, and we have to be custodians of those physical parts in the same way that we might tend a garden or manage a house or anything.
Custodian, it's true, but the custodian suggests that we're separate from
Right.
nature, and that's the whole problem, you see. Some wonderful works have been written recently, and not so recently, one by Mar Gregorius, an Indian theologian, called, what's it called now? It's a very small book, but he talks about nature, and he says the whole concept of man and nature is actually a completely wrong concept.
Right.
If you're a particle and you travel through your body, you wouldn't actually know when your body finished and air began, or if you're touching a tree.
Right.
So in fact, the whole of what we call nature is actually an extension of us, and we're an extension of that. We're higher than just a tree or a rock because we're spiritual beings. But immediately we think of nature and environment and us, we think, oh, we've got to look after it. And there's an element of truth in that. But if we think we're separate from that, then you have all sorts of problems.
Okay.
You know. So if I pollute the river here, literally someone down the river is going to be polluted by that water. We're all joined together.
Yeah.
So I think the ecological disaster is actually quite good in that sense. It shows us that in fact we're all interconnected. So again, go back to worship, that when I light a candle, when I make an icon, when I walk on the ground, I'm actually sort of touching myself in a way. The material cosmos is an extension of our body.
Yes.
And we're an extension of it. We are a microcosm. But also we're a macrocosm. And the Church Fathers emphasize more that we're a macrocosm because we're spiritual beings. We're bigger than the universe. The whole universe is contained in you and me. And if we break that link by sinning, by, as it were, acting against nature, then there's a consequence cosmologically. So the liturgy is so important. That's where the relationship of nous, mind, heart, body, all comes together.
Rejoining.
And rejoining. And then what you do after the liturgy, after the Eucharist, after prayer will naturally be good if you got it right there.
Yeah. So you see worship as being vital because that's how we set up our relationship with the world, and then we move out into the world, and then we.
I'll change the other way around. That
Right.
everything we do culminates in worship. Worship
Okay.
isn't a means to an end.
Okay.
Worship is the end. So once we get the end right, then everything will follow.
Yeah.
God is not a means to an end. We don't fit God into the gaps.
No, okay.
Sunday is not a sort of a day off where we have a bit of rest and go to church for a change. The whole of the week leads to the Eucharist, and then, which is quite right, after the Eucharist, after that peak of worship, then it's fulfilled. Like the word Mass, go forth into the world in peace afterwards. In a sense, the going out after the liturgy is a continuation of the liturgy of the
Right.
Eucharist.
Okay.
So it's not either or, it's both and, of course. But nonetheless, everything exists for the worship of God. That's our raison d'etre.
So how does the art support that process that you're talking about?
In a number of ways. First of all, the making of liturgical art is a microcosm of how we ought to act in the whole of creation. So as like on painter, you're taking representatives of all aspects of creation. So the pigment is from the mineral kingdom, the wooden panel is from the vegetable kingdom, the egg which binds the pigment is from the animal kingdom. So we bring all these together and make them even more articulate. So the act of making liturgical art is already making creation articulate. But then when we're worshipping, we use incense, we've got candles here, we smell God, we taste God, all these five senses are used. That affirms that we are physical beings.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we rejoice in that. The body is not an impediment to our love for God. It's a means of Him communicating with us. Like when you say something beautiful to me, it's just wavelengths, vibrations in the air. But through those vibrations in the air, something spiritual is communicated to me. Likewise, the other way, that I express my love for God through often physical things. So that affirms me as a physical being that's also spiritual. Also, thirdly, I think, an outcome of liturgical art done properly is mission. People sense that beauty and think, wow, where did that fragrance come from? You know, I want to be like that.
Yeah.
It touches your soul. My parish over COVID increased about 30%, my priest says. So I talked to some of the people who converted, and these are mainly younger people, 20s to 30s. most of them, it was through beauty, liturgical beauty. One just loved the evening services. We don't have much electricity in our parish church. He just loved the sort of soulishness of it, just the lamps in front of the icons. He just sort of fed on that beauty, and then he thought, wow, this fragrance is amazing. Where does it come from? I want to get to the source.
Yeah, I think we talked earlier about during COVID, because we weren't interacting with the world as much and we were kind of isolated and very much online, you know, we were kind of starved in a sensory way. And I was talking to you about how the first time I went to a concert was almost overwhelming because I hadn't heard live music. And I think, you know, after that experience and going forward into the kind of the future of technology, we're going to find that people really hunger for the sensory experience because, like you say, it speaks to all of our human senses simultaneously.
And God has ordered things, so the physical comes first and then the spiritual. And St Paul says that, the physical first and then the spiritual. So God comes to us in His humility through the despised things. You know, these frescoes here are painted with things we walk on. We walk on dirt, and they're made of dirt. So God raises the low things and makes them essential. Christ Himself became flesh. He wasn't ashamed to become flesh. He created matter and dust in the first place. Sometimes He used a word to heal people. Sometimes He spat on the ground, made clay. You know, He wasn't afraid of using matter. But I think above all, liturgical art keeps the faith personal. Beauty is a bit fluffy sometimes. You know, it's a feeling you have and you feel all gushy and all so nice. But beauty is God Himself. In Greek, the word dogma and doxa are the same. So dogma, true teaching, is also related to doxa, doxology and beauty and glory and splendor. So true beauty always leads us to the face of Christ. So we come in here and we're surrounded by faces, by saints, by Christ, the Mother of God, the angels. So I think above all, liturgical art, when it's done properly, keeps the Christian faith a living relationship with the living God and our brothers and sisters, the saints and the angels. Without that iconography in the fullest sense, be it frescoes, mosaics, icons, Christianity becomes a system too easily, a moral system. So after the iconoclasm of Henry VIII and Cromwell, what did they put in the wall? Just the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments are great. If you don't have images of living saints, then you become a moral system.
In a way, what I'm thinking when you're talking is some experiences of church that I've had that are very much about the word is it appeals to the intellect, you know, thought, and the things that you're talking about are much more subliminal and more experiential. And I, for me personally, when I've entered Orthodox churches or environments that are more sensory, you can't explain what you've experienced. Again, you can't put it into words, but you know something's happened, and again, there's a power there. I think that that needs acknowledging and understanding.
And I think, in a sense, to understand why you can't understand some things is to understand the anatomy of the human person, let's put it that way. So in a secular world, basically we're just bodies with a rather complex part of our body, which is called our brain. We forget the spiritual heart, and we've completely forgotten the nous, which is, there's no word for it really in English. It used to be intellectus in Latin, but now we think of intellect as just a brainy person. But the scriptures in the Church Fathers talk about body, soul, and spirit, and the nous is sometimes described as the eye of the heart. But whatever you call it, the spiritual element of us is that which perceives things directly without mediating. Like before I meet someone, I might know their age, where they're born. So I know about them, but I don't know them. But through an encounter of love and humility, the nous speaks to the nous, as the psalmist says, deep calls to deep. And that experience is more profound than just knowing about someone. You can't really explain it. Like falling in love, I suppose. You know, you can't. If you begin to dissect why you fall in love, you sort of kill the insect. You know, you've got a beautiful butterfly, let's kill it and dissect it. Well, you understand something is dead, not living. So this noetic faculty, this eye of the heart, and this we understand that that's the focal point of the human person through which everything is mediated. That's the control center. Then our liturgical art suffers. You know, iconography just becomes a storytelling mechanism to remind us of past events. But no, past events certainly happened. Christ was risen 2,000 years ago, but I used the image of a spring earlier. The spring came up 2,000 years ago, but that water runs forward in time to now. So when we celebrate Pascha, when we celebrate every Sunday Eucharist, we're drinking of the same water. That's a noetic experience. So the liturgical hymns don't say, let us piously consider and remember how Christ rose 2,000 years ago and imagine that we're there. No, they say, today Christ is risen. And it's not just poetic.
Okay.
It's an experience, an encounter of the living Christ. If we don't believe we're noetic beings, then we're just left with this history, really. Let's sort of think about an event that doesn't really have much to do with us. It's just a past event.
It's interesting you say about a storytelling device, because I'm a big admirer of Western medieval wall paintings. But I think we know that was their purpose, is for storytelling. And it's interesting that they're very high up on the walls, so you basically perceive them from the pews. And the experience of coming in here is much more a human relationship, being surrounded. You can literally relate to them in front of you. It's not something that you're viewing from below. So I guess that totally fits with what you're saying. That and I guess that relationship happens with the icon as well, because you stand in front of it and there's a physical relationship between you and the object. That's very important.
Perhaps now we can zoom in on one or two icons, and I can show how the way icons are done. And let's talk about icons not just as sort of Byzantine, exotic Russian things, but it's actually our own tradition. So we can talk about one or two of these now, and we can talk about how liturgical art is liturgical not just because of the subject matter, St Anthony, St Cuthbert, or whatever, but how it's depicted can have a transformative effect. So let's do that now.
So this is a beautiful icon of Christ. Can you explain why it's in this particular position?
Yes, so all sacred art has a role in the larger ritual. So in an Orthodox church, at least, you have some form of icon screen, and Christ is always on the right, and the Mother of God on the left. And then the royal doors might have the Annunciation, as in this case, or the four evangelists. So everything isn't just isolated, it's part of a whole. Not always, but Christ is normally a bust, half length, sometimes the full length ones. This particular icon of Christ is Christ the teacher. He holds the scriptures. Icons, as you've been talking, lead us to encounter with himself. So you never get Christ looking away from you. He might look slightly over your shoulder, but an icon will never show people in profile unless they're either bad people or sort of not that important, but virtually always three-quarter or full. So he's looking at us, engaging us. He's blessing us. What's interesting is the scriptures. This is a bit, we're talking about the noetic faculty. Sometimes icons will use perspective systems for various reasons, but one is to sort of throw us off balance a bit, to unsettle us a bit, so that they help us to go from here. The brain, the rational faculty, likes everything tidy, and sort of throws us off balance. And a bit like a bird that's in a nest, it doesn't really want to jump out of the nest because it's used to its comfortable little house there. So the mother's got to push it out, discomfort it, and then it suddenly discovers it's got wings and it enters another way of living.
Okay.
So sometimes icons throw us off balance, and so we notice that the lines of perspective come toward us, the viewer. So one reason is to helpfully transform the way we see, but also we think of us as being the prime actors. We're looking at Jesus, but in fact it's the other way around. He contemplates us. So the icon shows the world more from God's point of view. So I am the vanishing point. You are the vanishing point.
Yes.
So even if I walk out and stop contemplating Christ, he never stops contemplating me.
Okay.
This is why in Hebrew Psalms, they often say, Lord, do not forget your sin. Do not turn your face away from me. If God turns his face away from me, then I'd cease to exist. I'd not only die, but I'd cease to exist. So going to the point of liturgical art is not just a useful object, but the way that it's depicted is really theologically important.
Okay.
We could sing the Psalms with rock music or with Gregorian chant. They have different effects on our souls.
Yes. I think when you first see icons from a Western perspective, you that's the first thing that you notice is, like you say, so the background is gold, and the effect that has is that the figure comes forward. And I think when I first saw them, it felt like they were coming forward towards me, and in a way kind of asking to be received, you know. And I think, you know, that is something very common in Christianity, is the idea of receiving word, receiving communion, receiving the image. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's right. I think I know in my own life I've made mistakes by me trying to do a good thing in my own efforts,
Right.
rather than God being the prime actor and me just sort of doing what he wants me to do.
Yeah.
So sometimes I've had a good idea, but I try to force it, then of course it fails. Then I just sort of not give up, but okay, I give up trying to do it. And then in God's time, it happens, and then we participate in what God has done. So yeah, this is the idea that when we come into this chapel here and start praying, there's a real sense that we're not beginning a service, we're joining in the ceaseless worship of heaven. So participation, being met by God, rather than us doing everything and bringing in God to help us out.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the gold background, obviously it's incredibly beautiful and it draws attention and reflects light. But the technical effect it has is really to send that the background is flat, so the details of the figures really stand out and come forward. That's
right. It's the figure rather than the background. You do have background sometimes, like some of the frescoes here, but they're flattened a bit. It's a bit like if I do a painting of you, if a Rembrandt does a painting of you, he will leave the background a bit fuzzy, and as he gets closer to your face, he will do a more crisp detail. Yeah. So we're drawn to the most important thing. Yeah. But also the background is not background in a way. Think of a fish in water. You don't think of the water as background. It's a thing, a medium in which the fish lives and moves and has its being. And this raises another really important part of liturgical art, that it helps us to see the material world as a bush burning without being consumed. So that when Moses saw this bush that was burning without being consumed by the fire, clearly the fire was not ordinary fire. It was a divine fire. So I had this theory that it wasn't merely the bush that started to burn. The bush had always been burning with God's presence. And it wasn't the bush that changed, therefore, it was Moses. His eyes were open to see the bush as it always was. So the writer to the Hebrews in the scriptures says that all things are upheld by the word of his power. God doesn't just create with the word, he sustains it and guides it with the logos. So liturgical art should indicate, it can never depict that fire, but it can indicate the presence of that fire. So here we have Christ's undergarment, which is an earth red, that indicates his humanity. But also it's got these gold lines called a ceaston. So this shows that his humanity is not separated from his divinity, distinct from, but not separate. So he becomes human to drench, to soak, as it were, our humanity and his divinity. So this, if you like, symbolic method is used to reveal a bit of that fire of divinity. I think when you were talking just then about us joining something, it reminded me when I first came into the room, because you opened the door and the chapel was dark initially, and then the saints that surround us appeared. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, so a scientist would say, oh, that's light, your eyes adjusting to the light. But it was actually, I didn't know what to expect. And then because I'm interested in these images, they sort of came forward to me. Mm-hmm. That was a really interesting moment. And you were saying, when you mentioned that to me first, that in a sense, because we see not just with our eyes but with our mind, we need to want to see something for us to look. Yeah. If it had just been a blank wall, you wouldn't have probably bothered painting. No. But you could think, that is something I can just gradually see, so you concentrate and gradually your eyes adjust. And then it comes forward because it's something that you care about and love. And I think lots of psychologists have done experiments where humans really see the things that they're interested in or care about, and those things kind of blow out to them. And things maybe we're not concerned with kind of become invisible to us. So definitely when I first came in this room, it felt like I was joining something that was already here. I think that's one of the prophetical roles of liturgical art. We think of a prophet as one who speaks, but above all, a prophet is one who listens, who notices things. Right. Like when we see disasters in the world, we think, we've got to get the disaster sorted out. But really, we ought to be saying, what is creation? What is God? What is being said to us in that? So worship should reveal the logos of events. So you go into this dark space and gradually these things are revealed to you and you notice things. So gradually, slowly, things are revealed. So you had to be patient, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
You didn't come on, it's all dark, you got out, you have to stay here.
It really
you have to be patient to hear the word of the Lord.
Yeah, it really happened over about 2 minutes. And I thought, well, where's the light come from? And then about 5 minutes later, you actually did take the curtain back over the window and the real light came in. But before that, there was a light.
I wish I hadn't done that so soon, actually. But yeah, because it's amazing what you can see. When I was a child in New Zealand, we used to play hide and go seek at night. And in winter, you'd go out and it was really dark and thought, I can't play. But then, within 5 minutes, everything was really, really clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's about attention, because especially if you're playing that game, because it's hide and seek, so you're seeking, so your eyes are attuned, aren't they?
Yes.
And so you can see more, so...
I wondered if we can look at the floor next.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
because this introduces geometry. So let's turn the camera onto the floor.
So could you tell us about this lovely floor that we're looking at, please?
Yes. All the materials you see are recycled. And I wanted, having spent almost 2 years at a Vero monastery at Mount Athos, looking at the Cosmati floor, I realized that geometry can be used very much as part of our worship. God created mathematics as well as people. So the symbolism of all this is the first shape you encounter on entering is the square. And the square represents the created world, the 4 elements, the 4 corners. And God created us, St Irenaeus of Lyon, an early saint, said that God created us good, but not perfect. God created us to be united to God. So the square by itself is not sufficient. So the next shape is this one here. I'll get a bit closer. And this is a square united to a circle. A circle, of course, represents divinity. So here we have a circle distinct from a square, yet united to it. So this is Christ, God, the circle, as it were, enters the created world and unites himself to it in a union with distinction. But that's also the church. The church is the body of Christ. Also, it's an individual that bears the Holy Spirit. Also, the shape, we notice, has 4 circles going into the corners. So that's like God enters the world, and then through the 4 evangelists, through the Gospels, through the good news, his life goes into the whole world. But also there are 8 circles. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. But he rose on the 8th. So he enters the created cyclical 7 days, but he doesn't just want creation to go round and round in circles. He wants to give a direction toward the New Jerusalem. So he rises on the 8th day, which is connected to the 7 days of creation, but it's also the first and eternal day of the New Jerusalem. I was talking to the students yesterday, wasn't I, about how God comes to us out of the future.
Yes.
So we were in the paradise, but ultimately we're facing east. This whole church faced east toward the rising sun. We're facing toward the New Jerusalem. So the 8th day is sort of a reminder that everything's moving toward the New Jerusalem. Then if we go forward, we have here 2 shapes. We'll get a bit closer. The altar is there, and we notice, first of all, that the square in front of the altar consists of some darts coming out here. God comes out to us, and then the darts coming in toward the altar.
So you've actually used the direction of the grain and the wood in order to direct the attention.
So the liturgy is us offering ourselves and all the creation to God, the bread and the wine, and God comes to us and transforms our offering of ourselves and the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ.
Oh, that's so clever.
And here we have the ambo, the semicircular part, is where the gospel is read and where the sermon is given. So this is like the voice of God going out into all the world. So God doesn't just stay in heaven, he speaks, and his word is life-giving.
And that's wonderful how you've put those panels, so those lines of the inlay are facing both in and outwards, so there's that
True, yes.
direction.
That's right, yeah. Everything is this sort of dynamic movement of God coming to us going to God, and this this wonderful Greek word, pedagoresis, which is sort of interpenetration of, some say the choresis is like a dance between heaven and earth.
And can you talk about the colours? Is that two different woods? Or?
That's right. I mean, as I said, all of this was recycled. So the dark woods are from one of the patrons of the monastery, used to own a school, and the exotic wood is from the old chemist desks, I think. If I recall correctly, is from the teak from the science lab tables in a school that one of the patrons of the monastery used to own. The bits of oak around the outside, they were rejects. I had some timber given to me, which I had dried to make all the doors in this monastery, but some of it warped, so I cut them up into shorter bits, and all the bits of oak, mainly the borders of these things, are made from this reject oak.
What I love is the way that you've used that recycled wood, but you've also thought about the direction. So you've got these lines coming in the semicircle, as you say, going out, but they're also going in. So it's concentrating our attention towards the cross and towards the...
It's all to do with direction, isn't it? So one sort of moved toward in that direction, and God moves out to us. So I think every detail should reinforce the whole. We've often spoken about having an overall vision and all the details subservient to that. So even the direction of the grain.
It's all about reinforcing, isn't it? Every element. Because, you know, when I've designed things in film, something has to be there, and it may as well kind of speak to the story and the purpose of what you're doing, rather than being an arbitrary design. So,
and I think Jackson understood that. Is it Peter Jackson, the director? Yeah. I understand that in the set in New Zealand, there was a washing line there, and he had someone walk up and down on the grass toward the washing line for a few days before they filmed, to look as though it was being used.
Right.
And it was just a little detail, and that shot was probably only 2 seconds, but all these details accumulate to say something.
They really do. Yeah. They really do.
Sometimes when students show me an icon they've done, like yesterday, one of the students showed me a beautiful face, but the lettering let it all down. So your eyes were drawn to the thing that let it down. So the lettering is important, but the face is the most important thing. But the less important thing let down the most important.
Yes, we have to watch the details.
They do.
Because they support the whole story.
But not depend so much on detail. Sometimes in iconography, someone's so consummate in their skill, it gets a bit tight. So I think with the liturgical art, you've got to have a vision of the whole, and that can carry some weaknesses in technique, a bit like folk art sometimes, just incredible. It moves you, doesn't it? Even though it's a bit crude, but there's a vision that excites you.
Yes. So looking at these two paintings, Aidan, I noticed they're very different styles. Can you tell me, are they both yours?
No. This is by myself. This is by a wonderful woman iconographer. And you can see the styles are very different, yet the same ethos, I think. This one is more informed by the Byzantine tradition, so it's more modelled, if you like. It's flatter than, say, Renaissance painting. This is more inspired by the Russian tradition, which tends to flatten even more. There's no gold background, it's just a painted background, a greater degree of abstraction with the garments, for example. But this shows, I think, that there's tremendous creativity within the parameters of liturgical art. And that's a misconception, often because the icon world is so different from what we're used to. People sort of see them all as the same, but when you get to know them, you can date things often within 10, 20 years. Even if it's contemporary, you can say which artist painted it. So contrary to a lot of misconceptions, there is a lot of creativity. But with the function, you know, the function is not to show off your ego and to do something new for new's sake. It's to express the holiness of the saint. This is St John the Baptist. So Aileen has shown beautifully the sensitivity of St John the Baptist. You've got an indication of a sort of asceticism by this raggedy hair and this hair suit, but there's a gentleness.
The face is really beautiful, isn't it? And what's interesting is that it's set within the same screen, so there's a sense of it being part of the whole, but also there's an individuation between the two styles.
That's it. I think on the one hand you do want a vision to give unity, but you don't want it to be too mechanical.
Yeah.
You know, like families are messy businesses, aren't they? All come from the same mother and father, but they're really messy.
Yeah.
So I think you can be careless in developing a church, you know, not thinking enough, or you can be over tight and be too controlling.
Yes.
I think the main thing is if the vision is the same, like Pentecost, you know, by tradition, it's probably not literally true, but by tradition, the apostles are saying the creed in different languages. So that principle is they were declaring the same truth,
Yes.
but in the culture in which they were not so much living, but speaking too.
So in liturgical art, there should be unity, but there should also be freedom to express within a tradition.
That's it. I mean, God is incarnate in time and the world in general, but also in a particular culture. Mm-hmm. So in Britain, Romanesque art, to my mind, is the height of liturgical art. Things were stable enough. There was enough money around, there was enough political, social stability for lessons to be handed on and accumulated. And in the Saxon period, amazing metalwork done by the Celts in Ireland. We tend to think of the Celtic knotwork, but in fact their metalwork was even surpassed that of Byzantium at the time. So all these are particular cultural expressions that draw on the strengths of that particular culture and on limitations. I think we can talk about limitations. How important in liturgical
And they're all
art.
Innovations as well, some of them technical.
Oh, yeah. And I used to, before I became a member of the Orthodox Church, was a sculptor in the world. I could do what I wanted. And so you think, well, that's really free. But in a sense, I was limited to myself.
Yes.
When I entered the church, then, in a sense, there are parameters left and right, but the ceiling is much, much higher. Yeah. So the creativity is more that way. Yeah. That way, much more demanding. Do you find this yourself?
Yeah, that really chimes with my experience. Like you say, that at the outset you might think, well, stylistically it's more limiting, but then when you're inside of it, you realise, well, once your eye becomes attuned, you realise the incredible breadth of styles, and also just that you're standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's a gift. You know, if you're working in that language, just, you know, the hundreds of years of incredible composition and, you know, figuring things out that you can look at and learn from. So, I mean, for me, that's much more exciting than being in a studio and you know, just doing self-expression, for example, because, you know, hundreds of years of history is much more interesting than just me.
It expands you, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
I mean, it's like you can be free by chaining yourself to your ankle and go wherever you want, but really you change yourself. So you haven't got that much freedom.
Yeah.
I could join a community and so I'll go where you go, and they go all over the world. So in fact,
as an artist, it's like, oh my goodness, look what I could become. Look at this incredible language that is here for us, you know.
And do you think that's why modern science has progressed so quickly? Because it's a communal effort.
Yeah.
I mean, Einstein is built on individual discoveries, but he put them together. No scientist makes a discovery out of complete nothing. They're receiving it through tradition of what's been discovered and then extending beyond it, joining things together.
It's a very good point, because I think what I've also noticed in the scientific community is there's lots of global interaction and sharing, isn't there, between countries in terms of, you know, getting scientific innovation to, especially you know, medical innovations to come forth, because everyone wants it. So that working together is kind of very productive.
Perhaps we can talk about the degree of abstraction in icons, and we can look at the face of St Cuthbert. We can talk about this balance between naturalism, what we see with our physical eye, and what we see with our noetic eye.
Yes. So looking at these two paintings, Aidan, I noticed they're very different styles. Can you tell me, are they both yours?
No. This is by myself. This is by a wonderful woman iconographer. And you can see the styles are very different, yet the same ethos, I think. This one is more informed by the Byzantine tradition, so it's more modelled, if you like. It's flatter than, say, Renaissance painting. This is more inspired by the Russian tradition, which tends to flatten even more. There's no gold background, it's just a painted background, a greater degree of abstraction with the garments, for example. But this shows, I think, that there's tremendous creativity within the parameters of liturgical art. And that's a misconception, often because the icon world is so different from what we're used to. People sort of see them all as the same, but when you get to know them, you can date things often within 10, 20 years. Even if it's contemporary, you can say which artist painted it. So contrary to a lot of misconceptions, there is a lot of creativity, but with the function, the function is not to show off your ego and to do something new for new's sake. It's to express the holiness of the saint. This is St John the Baptist. So Aidan has shown beautifully the sensitivity of St John the Baptist. You've got an indication of a sort of asceticism by this raggedy hair and this hairsuit, but there's a gentleness.
The face is really beautiful, isn't it? And what's interesting is that it's set within the same screen, so there's a sense of it being part of the whole, but also there's an individuation between the two styles.
That's it. I think on the one hand you do want a vision to give unity, but you don't want it to be too mechanical.
Yeah.
Like families are messy businesses, aren't they? All come from the same mother and father, but they're really messy. So I think you can be careless in developing a church, not thinking enough, or you can be over tight and be too controlling.
Yes.
I think the main thing is if the vision is the same, like Pentecost, by tradition, it's probably not literally true, but by tradition, the apostles are saying the creed in different languages. So that principle is they were declaring the same truth, but in the culture in which they were not so much living, but speaking to.
So in liturgical art, there should be unity, but there should also be freedom to express within a tradition.
That's it. I mean, God is incarnate in time and the world in general, but also in a particular culture. So in Britain, Romanesque art, to my mind, is the height of liturgical art. Things were stable enough. There was enough money around. There was enough political, social stability for lessons to be handed on and accumulated. And then the Saxon period, amazing metalwork done by the Celts in Ireland. We tend to think of the Celtic knotwork, but in fact their metalwork was even surpassed that of Byzantium at the time. So all these are particular cultural expressions that draw on the strengths of that particular culture and on limitations. I think we can talk about limitations, how important in liturgical
And they're all
art.
innovations as well, some of them technical.
Oh, yeah. And I used to, before I became a member of the Orthodox Church, was a sculptor in the world. I could do what I wanted. And so you think, well, that's really free. But in a sense, I was limited to myself.
Yes.
When I entered the church, then in a sense, there are parameters left and right, but the ceiling is much, much higher.
Yeah.
So the creativity is more that way.
Yeah.
That way, much more demanding. Do you find this yourself?
Yeah, that really chimes with my experience. Like you say, that at the outset you might think, well, stylistically it's more limiting, but then when you're inside of it, you realise, well, once your eye becomes attuned, you realise the incredible breadth of styles, and also just that you're standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's a gift. You know, if you're working in that language, just the hundreds of years of incredible composition and figuring things out that you can look at and learn from. So, I mean, for me, that's much more exciting than being in a studio and just doing self-expression, for example, because, hundreds of years of history is much more interesting than just me.
It expands you, doesn't it?
It does,
I mean, it's like you can be free by chaining yourself to your ankle and go wherever you want, but really you change yourself. So you haven't got that much freedom.
Yeah.
I could join a community and I'll go where you go, and they go all over the world. So in fact,
as an artist, it's like, oh my goodness, look what I could become. Look at this incredible language that is here for us, And
do you think that's why modern science has progressed so quickly? Because it's a communal effort.
Yeah.
I mean, Einstein is built on individual discoveries, but he put them together. No scientist makes a discovery out of complete nothing. They're receiving it through tradition of what's been discovered and then extending beyond it, joining things together.
It's a very good point, because I think what I've also noticed in the scientific community is there's lots of global interaction and sharing, isn't there, between countries in terms of, getting scientific innovation to, especially, medical innovations to come forth, because everyone wants it. So that working together is kind of very productive.
Perhaps we can talk about the degree of abstraction in icons, and we can look at the face of St Cuthbert. We can talk about this balance between naturalism, what we see with our physical eye, and what we see with our noetic eye.
Yes, let's do that. So Aidan, when we're looking at this painting of St Cuthbert, can you talk to us about the style and how naturalistic is this painting, and why? Are there elements that are more naturalistic than others?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When people first see icons, they notice how, would they say, unrealistic they are. I actually say that a good icon is more realistic than a photograph.
Okay.
It's not so naturalistic as a photograph, because we are a union of invisible and visible. So an icon, like a good portrait, will try to indicate some of that in the character.
Okay.
So obviously it's a human person with two eyes, a nose, but things are elongated a bit. The nose is made more narrow than normal. There's certain emphasis in the asceticism of St Cuthbert. So in general, you're trying to indicate a union of opposites, and an inner and an outer, a spiritual and a physical. So look at the sadness in his eyes, but there's a slight joy in his lips. So there, I wanted to show that Cuthbert, and we know from his life, there is an anonymous life, and St Bede writes about him. We know he's a very compassionate, loving person, but a great ascetic as well, so he really knew suffering. So I wanted to show this union of joy and sadness. Why sadness, you might say? Are we depicting him in heaven now? That's because the saints never leave us. They always feel loving and compassionate for us. They co-suffer with us.
Okay.
So even in the heaven, they identify with our struggles. If I were going through a hard time, I wouldn't want to pray in front of a big cheesy smiling saint. Cheer up, it'll be all right.
Okay.
I want to feel them with me. Not being dragged down, but not just sort of from a lofty position saying, you'll be all right, mate.
So it's an expression of emotion.
More than emotion, an inner state, really,
Okay.
yes. So sometimes you can get it wrong, a bit too sad, sometimes too smiley, so you're trying to bring these two together. So in that sense, liturgical art, and particularly faces, aim for realism but not naturalism.
Okay.
So realism is indicating, you can't really depict them, but indicate invisible realities as well as visible ones.
Okay. And when you're painting someone like Cuthbert, do you have any reference points for how he may have looked? Is that still important, or?
I think it is. I think iconography has suffered somewhat from a standard face, particularly female saints, the standard face and to slap another name on. But my experience of saints, and I've known some who've been canonized, St Paisius, St Porphyrius I met once, and St Sophrony, and they were very distinct, very different people.
Yes.
So I think iconography, without descending into straight naturalism, should indicate this diversity. The name is important. I think when we repent, to the degree that we repent, we find our true self, not in the modern psychological sense, but we find the true name that God has given to us.
Okay.
So I think we should reflect that in iconography. So I studied what I knew of him. So we knew that he had a tonsure like this. Right. Later on in life. In his tomb was found this cross. So this is actually literally a cross that he would have worn. Okay. I researched whether or not they would have had beards or not, what sort of haircut they would have had. Interestingly, I painted an icon of St Cuthbert, having done research on him and prayed. And I was in a car with the priest of the parish I was then in, and a Australian Greek lady, on the road to Lindisfarne on a pilgrimage. And I brought out a photograph of this icon I painted of St Cuthbert. And she said, "Who's that?" And I said, "Cuthbert." And she was quiet for a while, and she said, "I don't believe it. I had a dream a while back, and in an orchard, a field of flowers, and a man came toward me and gave me some flowers. And he looked just like that. And he said, 'My name's Cuthbert.'" So that was amazing.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about it's the real cross that he would have worn. It feels to me like you're talking about a marriage of the material and the spiritual. So it's the aspects of his character along with some of the things that we actually know about his physical person. What I'm wondering is the saints that you've known, that you've actually met, and you might have photographs of them or you've seen them. Is the process the same? Is it more difficult in some ways to paint those saints because you could paint them entirely figuratively because we have all the information, whereas with the older saints, there's a natural process of abstraction that has to happen because we haven't known them in their lifetime?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, the three saints I mentioned, we have at least prints of their icons in my parish church. And some depend too much on just the photograph that exists, but others manage to abstract. And the word abstract is interesting. It doesn't really mean to depart from reality. It means to draw out something that's there.
Okay.
So in the academic world, an abstract is actually a précis, a summary of the essence of a much longer academic paper. So true abstraction is to discover and then distill the essential characteristics. So that's the challenge when it's an icon of a living saint or someone who's lived recently, of whom we have photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to know them really. So prayer, living the liturgical life, you get to know the saints personally, leading their life. Saint Elizabeth, new martyr Elizabeth, I think she's the great-great-aunt of King Charles. She wrote a lot of letters to her grandmother, Queen Victoria, and they're in English, though she was German herself. So we have a real insight into her inner state. So when I painted icons of her, it's been a bit easier in that sense, because though we have photographs, also we have these quite detailed letters that indicate something of her inner spirit.
Oh, how interesting. Thank you. So Aidan, you've mentioned that liturgical art goes beyond the paintings to things like furnishings and frames and screens. Could you talk about this screen in particular with this lovely moulding?
Yes. Furnishings do take up a big surface area in a church, and we could say, well, they're just to sit on or to hold things, so they're not that important. But because they fill such a large area, they are really important. The materials, the colour of them, the detailing. Yeah. When you think of one's life in a church, if you add up all those hours, so in our church it's 2 hours every Sunday, so even if I go once a week, 52 times 2, that's 100 hours looking at things. So the details you notice. Yeah. So in this case, because it's in Britain, I drew on the British tradition, particularly of scratch moulded oak work. You see it a lot in houses and in churches. Okay. And I like imperfection. The abbot of my monastery at Mount Athos, Father Vasilius, he used to often say there's a perfect imperfection and an imperfect perfection. So I could have done this moulding here with a router, which would have been perfect, but wouldn't really have consoled the soul. It would just be a machine smashing through the grain. But sure. I use what's called a scratch mould, and that's got an imperfection, and the light reflects off it differently because it's affected by the grain a bit.
Yes.
And just run your finger over that and feel it.
Yes.
You see, you can feel it. It's got life to it, hasn't it?
Yes, it has, and I can see.
Yeah, you can really see it.
And that undulating surface.
Yeah.
So is it important to have the sort of human hand at these things, especially around this icon and in the altar where we're if we're in the congregation, we're going to be seeing this up close. It's very important. So would you put more thought and detail into this than the door frame, for example, or would the door frame be as important?
The door would certainly be as important.
Okay.
In fact, I've done a big job for a Russian church in Madrid, and there are a lot of icons on it, carved panels and icons on the inside.
The exterior door?
It was the entrance into the nave, but it was interior. But I've been asked to design one for an exterior door in America, which
and you would still want the hand detail.
Yeah, I mean sometimes you can't afford the hand detail.
Yeah.
But even if you've got to use machines in some way, make sure it's done with love.
Yes.
I think love is like sunlight on a stone. You put a stone out in the sun all day, and in the night when the sun's gone down, it gives off that warmth.
Yeah.
And I think love put into making something gives off love.
I totally agree. It's about investment in materials.
Yeah,
time.
And I think if you're not going to invest that in your church, which is the most important part, that's the throne of the King of Kings, why spend £10 on a church article and spend £60,000 on a kitchen?
Yeah.
People real priorities are wrong sometimes.
Yeah.
So, so materials as well. Oak is sort of the quintessential English wood. This is actually all recycled. The panels here are from old pews that are being literally sawn up for firewood by the local farmer in our church in Shrewsbury.
And do you just use what you inherit, or do you like oak because of its connection with the English landscape?
Both, really. Yeah. I think it's you want to use the best for church, and oak is just so quintessentially English. I've used other woods as well. I did an icon screen for a church in Bath in a Georgian house, and there are arches there, and it's, Georgian stone is a bar stone rather is quite light, so I used a honey-coloured wood. So there I used sycamore and lime wood and used a shellac on it to give it a golden glow warm. So everything's got to be contextualised, just like your film set design.
Yes.
If it's for Saxon film, you don't put in Georgian stuff.
No.
You've got to contextualise things.
Yeah, it has to belong. It has to belong to A, the building, and B, then the wider environment as well. So that's where you're taking the materials from.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think detailing, bit of interest to distinguish it from your kitchen. So here I've used pegs. There's no glue in this, I think. It's all water, centennial, and pegs. And the fact that it's recycled wood, and this is much older than that, so it's slightly darker. Wood oxidizes with time.
It makes it very tactile.
Yeah. Well, standing in my church in Shrewsbury, you have a lot of time to look at the light reflecting off the oak screen there, and I used the same technique there. Yeah. Some parts I used router for, just because of complicated reasons, but it's nothing like the scratch moulding. I just love looking at that.
It gives a kind of light effect that has a sort of dynamism. It reminds me of, we've talked about mosaics, the way the tiles are set at different angles, so you get that glimmer as the light travels across. And that's quite important, isn't it? In just like you say, these environmental details that really make the difference once they're compound.
We tend to think of beauty often from the Platonic background as stasis, as something still and balanced. But interestingly, Byzantine descriptions of churches consider beauty much more dynamically. They'll often say, they go into Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, for example, and they say, I didn't know where to rest my eyes. I was drawn hither and thither, and the light was moving. And a book's been written recently by Sarah Duncheva, if I got her name correct, where she united with other scholars and scientists to look at Hagia Sophia, the chant there, at the fluidity of the stone. They often chose vein marble to be like water. Okay. And of course it's really near the water. And you can listen on YouTube to Byzantine chant adapted acoustically in the computer to the acoustics of Hagia Sophia, and she talks about the hymnography, how it relates to water, and how that's reflected, and the detailing of the veining of the marble. So every detail, and even choosing the veining of the marble, reflected something spiritual, or also built up a story, built up a symphony.
Yes.
So these details do matter.
Yes.
And also another set of scholars have done work on the reveals of the windows around the base of the Hagia Sophia dome, and they adjusted the angle of the window sills to see how that would affect, they could do this on the computer, affect the light reflecting on the dome, which used to be gold. And that angle they got is the perfect angle. And one of the architects was an expert in his time on angles of reflection. He was a mathematician, so he'd obviously worked it out. In fact, I think they've discovered a drawing where he's working on the angles of incidence of light.
That's incredible.
So that detailing, to get the effect, he knew what effect he wanted with light.
Yes.
And he used science to get that effect. He didn't just do it for fun.
Yes.
He knew the effect on the soul that he wanted and selected accordingly.
So this is the incredible tradition that we're...
I tell you, we're complete barbarians compared to these people, and modern research has shown us acoustically.
Yes.
Work has been done on acoustics in, I think, 8 medieval churches in Hagia Sophia. You want quite a high resonance for singing, to have a sort of living, like a dialogue between the choir and the church. So if you sing and there's a 7-second resonance, it's like it's singing back to you. So you can almost have an antiphony going with it. But on the other hand, the spoken word doesn't like high resonance. Otherwise you start, one word overlaps the other. And they found that in places in the ambo, when the sermon is given, there has a different resonancy there, a short one.
Right.
Whereas where the choir is and the people listen to the choir, it's a high resonancy. So nowadays we can make quite good orchestral, what do you call them? Not stadia, places where they have concerts, concert halls. Yeah, really great for music, but hopeless for the spoken word and vice versa. But here they combine the two. So we're complete barbarians by comparison.
That's so interesting, and I think thinking about this, it's if one aspect of church art is at the highest level, it encourages those other aspects to to be raised, in the same way. So, for example, I love going to English cathedrals, and one of the first times I went into Ely, there was the evensong was being sung, and it suited the space so well, and you just realise all these things have to work in tandem, and
often things are composed for a particular church.
Yeah,
and acoustic, and a particular organ as well. Bach, you compose for a particular organ.
Exactly that. And in a way, one thing, just going back to films, one thing I've noticed is if one department's really paying attention to what it's supposed to be doing, it inspires all the other departments.
And that's an example inspires.
Yeah, I think so, because it's the same thing, that it's all a collaboration between composers, people who build things, the designers, the script people, and if everyone kind of loses faith, it can fall apart quite quickly. But if one of the departments is setting an example, people think, oh, they've put a lot of effort in there, we need to live up to that, And so it could be in church life, really, that everyone kind of inspires each other to do their best work.
Perhaps we can finish this podcast then by summarising a few critical elements of what liturgical art is and how we can move forward to improve it in our own age. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great. So, brought me to this chapel, and I think it's very inspiring because I can see all the elements that you've talked about, all the aspects of liturgical art in the Orthodox Church in one very small space. And I think it's interesting to show people, what can be achieved on this scale. One of the issues we've got in the UK when I look at churches is that they have a lot of heritage, and so it's difficult to know where to start because you're dealing with quite complex buildings with different languages. And I think what you've done here is to really create a kind of prototype for how a church can work, that we can learn from.
Yes, I think you raised a lot of really important points there. I think the history we have in Britain is a blessing, but also a burden.
Yes.
If it's an Anglican church, there's a lot already there which limits what you can do. But a limitation is also a strength. So I think one's got to, if we can summarise how we can go forward, I think start small.
Yes.
There's a church in London where the priest is asked how we can move forward in making it more beautiful. And half the congregation might be evangelicals who don't like images much. So the idea is to start with the side chapel, just make a small area really beautiful, and then we think people will be won over, then you can go into the main. So start small, have a vision, what you're trying to do, what effect one's trying to have on the soul. The more difficult thing is find good liturgical artists, which is why I've started the 3-year part-time course that you're involved in. Liturgical art, as we've been, I think, discussing, is a specialist field. You can get the best architect or the best artist in the world, but if you just throw them in the deep end and say, right, design a church or paint a fresco, it's unfair on them because it's a really specific area. You need to know your theology, your liturgy, and live the life of the church. So you're painting or making something which you know by experience, not reading about it in books. So we do need certainly to train liturgical artists to meet the need. But I think you have vision, don't let limitations stop you doing it, work within the limitations. I didn't have much money at all doing this. I think the total cost of materials in this whole church here is probably about £800. The pigments for the walls, probably about £30. The lime plaster for the walls, probably about 100. Virtually all the wood is given second hand.
It's about the vision, isn't it?
It's a vision.
It is that you were at the centre of it, and you knew what you wanted to achieve, and like you say, the means follows that. And
then you can draw on people of different abilities. So the patterns around the bottom. I had a friend help me, David, who's now actually started a liturgical arts centre in America. And then an old man helped me plaster the wall. He'd come up in the middle of winter. Other people helped lay the floor. The local farmer helped me pour the cement floor, and so on and so forth.
People were donating wood.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So I think if you have an exciting vision, people want to give to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's really inspiring.
Thank you so much, Heather, for having you, and you're just the right person to ask with your film background, and Great.
It's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks, Aidan.
Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope you found this helpful, and if you enjoyed it, please tune in and listen to some of the other podcasts. Each one has a particular theme. This one, which is the first in the series, looks really just at what liturgical art is in its broadest sense. Others will look at how we can make it, how we can commission it, what objectives people put to spending money on it. Aren't white walls better than having distracting images on? All these things we'll also discuss. Thank you.